In 1938, tales were circulating in Pulaski County, Kentucky, of a murderous ghost that had claimed 5 lives. All who died did so in similar circumstances that couldn't be explained. It's a story so chilling it drove a community to seek out desperate measures. Carl Pruitt was a local man who was a carpenter by trade and said to be hard-working. But sadly, there was another side to Carl, one that was a bit darker. You see, he had a violent temper, and so imagine his reaction when he came home one day, earlier than expected, and discovered his wife in bed with another man. Terrified but shocked by his sudden appearance, his wife threw herself at his mercy, desperately trying to explain her actions, which gave the other man a chance to escape out of the window, avoiding any anger set to come his way. But the fury raging inside Carl by this point had taken over any chance that he might think calmly, and instead he threw himself at his wife, grabbing a chain that he wrapped around her throat and squeezed tighter and tighter until her hands went limp and her eyes glazed over. Letting her lifeless body drop to the floor, Carl was suddenly hit by all the emotions that the fury had hidden from him. He was heartbroken at killing his wife, quickly followed by guilt and remorse. Scrambling through drawers in his home, he came across his pistol, which he placed to his head and fired. As you can imagine, murder-suicide was the talk of the town, with locals being shocked at the events that had taken place. By the time it came around for Carl's funeral, his wife's family insisted they wanted him buried nowhere near their daughter. You can understand their feelings on this, and his final resting place was quite a distance from it, with many hoping that their souls could now rest in peace. But this is where the tale takes a darker twist. You see, maybe Carl wanted to be buried next to his wife. He loved her and, in his mind, had forgiven her betrayal. Or maybe the murder-suicide had done nothing to calm his troubled mind, and with no one mourning his passing, all the rage he felt at the time of his death had now warped into something much more troubling and sinister. Before long, circular patches of dead grass were appearing around his grave, seemingly scattered in appearance, but over time the brown patches of ground started to form a pattern, one of a chain like the murder weapon he'd used on his wife. Locals became fascinated by this and terrified at the same time. What was causing this to happen around his grave? As you can imagine, it sparked the interests of the local kids, who would dare each other to go to the grave and see what the spooky markings were. One young group, led by James Collins, cycled to the cemetery to get a better look at the grave. Wanting to prove he was not afraid of Carl Pruitt and his strange burial plot, James threw rocks at the gravestone, finally chipping a large piece from the corner. Feeling he'd proven his point, James and his friends jumped back on their bikes and made their way towards the front gates of the cemetery, when suddenly a freak accident occurred. The chain on James's bike suddenly snapped, flipping the bicycle with James still on it. His friends heard the commotion and ran to get help, but by the time they returned, James was found choked to death, with the bicycle chain wrapped around his neck. His friends tried explaining to the adults what had occurred and showed them the place where the chipped-off gravestone had landed. But the gravestone was not broken in any way. It was as if it had been miraculously fixed. News travelled around the community, and before long everyone knew that the boy's death was caused by the ghost of Carl Pruitt. So after burying her son, Mary Collins, filled with anger and grief, picked up an axe and decided to take her fury out on the person responsible. She went to Carl's grave. She swung at his gravestone again and again, chipping away at the stone until finally it was in pieces. Dusting herself off, she headed out of the cemetery, and this was the last time she was seen alive. You see, the following day she was going about her chores and was hanging the washing outside to dry when suddenly the young mother tripped. Trying to find something to hold on to in her fall, she grabbed at the clothesline, but instead of finding her footing, the cord got wrapped around her throat, getting tighter and tighter, strangling her. When Mary's death was also discovered around town, locals went to look at the gravestone and once again found it completely intact. How could this be? Things can't just fix themselves like that. So that left only one solution, right? It was paranormal. Fear by this point was like a virus that infected anyone who heard about Carl Pruitt's murderous spirit. People would do anything to avoid having to walk past the cemetery, just in case they came under the scrutiny of his spirit and became another victim. But one local farmer was travelling with his family in their horse-drawn carriage when the topic came up about the grave. Not wanting to sound like he was afraid in front of his family, he decided to drive by the cemetery and prove his bravery. As they approached the entrance, he took out his pistol and shot at the gravestone, breaking off a piece of the rock. Sadly, the noise from the gun startled the horses and they shot off at speed. The farmer desperately tried to calm the horses down and his family managed to jump to safety in time. Unfortunately, the carriage overturned and the farmer was discovered entangled in the reins, having choked to death. This was the third death to have occurred after interaction with Carl Pruitt's grave. Fear now gripped the community in a vice-like grip, with locals wanting answers. 2 police officers were sent out to investigate, but again, respect was not shown on the grounds as one of the officers joked about how stupid it was for them to be wasting time hunting for ghosts. He even snapped some photographs in the vicinity of where Pruitt's remains lay. But as they drove away, the officer who had mocked the supernatural suddenly became very afraid. He saw a ball of bright light following the car, getting faster, causing him to crash into a fence. The passenger, who wasn't wearing a seatbelt, went straight through the windshield of the car, but was injured but thankfully not killed. The same cannot be said for the driver, who was practically beheaded by a chain strung between 2 fence posts. Well, locals had just about had enough at this point. The police didn't seem able to help and visiting family buried at the cemetery was something everyone now dreaded. By the 1940s, families were having their loved ones moved to different cemeteries. Finally, there only appeared to be one gravestone left in the lonely area, that of Carl. One angry local guy, though, decided to enter the grounds with a hammer and chisel, furious that this deceased man was causing so much trouble. He started smacking away at the large stone, and the sound reverberated all around, with local homes to the area hearing the chiselling taking place, but choosing to ignore it. That is, until the sound stopped and a blood-curdling scream filled the night sky. Local men grabbed their lanterns and dashed off toward the cemetery to help the man as much as they could. What the men witnessed stayed with them forever. The man had seen something at the grave, maybe the bright orb of light that the officers had seen, and became so petrified he made a run towards the gates. Somehow, he became entangled in the chains that secured the gates and he was found, choked to death. It seems that anyone who was stupid or brave enough to go near Carl Pruitt's final resting place and show disrespect ends up the same way as his murdered wife, strangled to death. Also, no matter how much damage is done to the gravestone, it always ends up completely untouched and intact. The end to this story happened in 1958 when a strip mining operation destroyed both the burial and surrounding areas. But is the tale true, or is it something that has been made up and become real over time? Many seem to be torn on this, as the story has gone back so far and with real people's names mentioned that surely it must be real. People have tried to trace the history of the area and to discover the fates of the people mentioned, but there are no news reports covering the deaths and no other tangible evidence to support the claims. So might it well be a ghost story to set the nerves on edge of children thinking of getting up to mischief? Another version of the boogeyman. Behave yourselves, or the ghost of Carl Pruitt will make sure you can't misbehave again. Or maybe it is a true story that has been hidden away from public scrutiny so that no more deaths can occur at the hands of the vengeful spirit that is Carl Pruitt. What do you think? Until next time, stay safe out there.